In the harsh and unforgiving wilds of 19th century colonial Australia, law and legend were often indistinguishable. Among the dust, the eucalyptus trees, and the iron rails of expanding British rule, one name echoed louder than the rest: Ned Kelly. To some, he was a cold-blooded outlaw. To others, a rebel hero who stood against the tyranny of the British Empire. What he became was more than a man. He became myth. This is the story of the Australian bushranger who defied the crown and became a legend. Welcome to Historical Channel, uncovering untold stories, hidden facts, and the strangest chapters of history. Before he was a bushranger, before the iron helmet and the bullets, Ned Kelly was just a boy. A boy born into hardship, carrying the weight of a colony's inequality before he ever understood it. Edward Kelly, known to all as Ned, was born in December 1854 in the small rural town of Beveridge, about 40 kilometers north of Melbourne, in what was then the colony of Victoria. His parents, John Red Kelly and Ellen Quinn, were Irish immigrants. His father, Red, had been a convict, transported from Tipperary to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, for the crime of stealing 2 pigs. After serving his sentence, Red moved to Victoria to start anew. He married Ellen Quinn, a tough and resourceful Irish-Australian woman. Together, they tried to build a life in a land that was far from fair. They were Catholic, poor, and Irish, in a colony run by Protestant English elites who viewed people like the Kellys as lesser. Ned was the third of 8 children. The family scratched out a living as selectors, subsistence farmers, on marginal land. Unlike squatters, who occupied vast tracts granted by the government, selectors like the Kellys were given poor, rocky, and often unviable land, pushing them into debt and confrontation with authorities. The land wars between squatters and selectors were more than legal disputes. They were battles over survival. Squatters had influence, wealth, and ties to the police and politicians. Selectors, often Irish or Scottish immigrants, had little more than determination and resentment. From birth, Ned Kelly was positioned at the edge of a social fault line. The colonial police, many of whom were ex-soldiers or British-born Protestants, often viewed Irish Catholic families as troublemakers. Petty crimes led to harsh penalties. Disputes with landowners or neighbors could quickly escalate into criminal charges. For the Kellys, the local constabulary was not protection, it was persecution. When Ned was just 11, his father, Red, died of dropsy, likely brought on by alcoholism and poverty. Red Kelly's death had a profound impact. Ellen was left to raise the children alone. Ned, now the eldest male, became the man of the house at a time when boys still played with sticks and stones. To survive, the Kellys often relied on the extended Quinn and Lloyd families, names that would later become infamous in bushranger lore. The children worked young. Ned ran errands, herded livestock, and helped neighbors. But trouble found him early. In 1869, at just 14 years old, Ned was arrested for allegedly assaulting a Chinese hawker named Ah Fook. According to Ah Fook, Ned had attacked him with a stick and stolen money. But the case was murky. Ned claimed self-defense. Eventually, the charges were dropped, but the stain remained. Only months later, Ned became an apprentice to Harry Power, a notorious bushranger operating in the Wombat Ranges. Power, who had escaped from prison, was hiding in the hills and needed local knowledge. Young Ned, bold and sharp, became his scout. For a time, the two carried out highway robberies, stealing from travelers and mail coaches. But the police were closing in. Eventually, Power was betrayed, allegedly by the Kelly family, and arrested. Ned was briefly jailed, but released due to lack of evidence. But this brush with the law cemented his reputation. Even as a teenager, police now saw him not as a misguided youth, but as a marked man. By age 16, Ned was arrested again, this time for allegedly receiving a stolen horse from a known bushranger. The case, full of contradictions, still ended with Ned receiving 3 years hard labor, 3 years in prison for a teenager, based on circumstantial evidence. By the time he emerged from jail in 1874, Ned Kelly was no longer a boy. He was 19 years old, broad-shouldered, hardened by prison walls, and filled with a simmering hatred for the system that seemed determined to crush his family. But it wasn't just about him. The Kellys were constantly harassed by the local constabulary. Minor disputes turned into criminal charges. Ellen Kelly, Ned's mother, was arrested more than once. Neighbors and relatives were routinely targeted. It seemed that simply being a Kelly was reason enough for suspicion. This systematic persecution was not unique to Ned. It was the lived experience of many poor Irish-Australian families in colonial Victoria. But Ned Kelly would not endure it quietly. He would fight back. The pressure was unrelenting. The Kelly family, now fatherless, was watched day and night, their home raided, their movements questioned. For many selector families, the bush was already hard enough. But for the Kellys, survival meant enduring a government that treated them as criminals simply for existing. Then came the tipping point. In April 1878, Constable Alexander Fitzpatrick rode alone to the Kelly homestead, allegedly to arrest Dan Kelly for horse theft. What followed remains shrouded in contradiction. Fitzpatrick claimed he was shot by Ned and assaulted by Ellen Kelly and others. He said Ned tried to kill him, but many believed the constable had been drunk and had behaved inappropriately toward Ned's sister, Kate, just 14 years old at the time. The truth may never be fully known, but what happened next would shape history. Based solely on Fitzpatrick's account, Ellen Kelly was sentenced to 3 years in prison, her newborn baby still at her breast. It was swift, brutal justice, justice that spoke volumes about who had power in the colony and who did not. Ned and Dan, knowing they would never get a fair hearing, fled to the bush. They became outlaws, not by choice, but by necessity. The colony branded them criminals, but in the shadowed hills of northeastern Victoria, among selectors and stockmen who had known the same injustices, the Kelly boys became something else entirely. Legends. 2 others joined them. Joe Byrne, Ned's childhood friend, educated, articulate, and fluent in Chinese. And Steve Hart, a dashing young horseman from Wangaratta. Together, they formed the Kelly Gang. 4 young men with nothing to lose and a score to settle with the crown. The authorities called it evasion, but to the people in Kelly country, it was resistance. They were not hiding, they were preparing. On October 26, 1878, the police made their move. A 4-man party, Sergeant Kennedy and Constables Scanlon, Lonigan, and McIntyre, set out into the Wombat Ranges to capture the Kelly brothers. They underestimated what they would find. Ned and his gang had been tracking the police for days. At Stringy Bark Creek, they struck. Ned stepped forward and called on the officers to surrender. Lonigan reached for his gun. Ned fired. The constable died instantly. Later that day, Kennedy and Scanlon returned to the camp. Once again, Ned ordered them to surrender. Scanlon raised his rifle. Gunfire erupted. Both officers were killed. Only McIntyre escaped to tell the tale. The news exploded across the colony. Newspapers screamed of murder. The government issued warrants for the gang's immediate capture, dead or alive. A bounty of £800 was placed on their heads, rising quickly to £2,000. No questions asked. For the Kelly gang, there was no turning back. But to many of the poor in Victoria, the gang's defiance was cause for quiet admiration. The Kellys had done what others only dreamed of. They had fought back. In December 1878, the gang struck again, this time robbing the National Bank in Euroa. The operation was executed with military precision. They took over 30 hostages but ensured no blood was spilled. They posed for photographs. They mocked the police. They vanished into the bush without a trace. And in February 1879, they did it again. In Geraldary, across the border in New South Wales, they rode in disguised as policemen, locked the local troopers in their own cell, and emptied the town's bank vaults. But it wasn't just about the money. Ned had come to Geraldary with a message. He handed over a handwritten manifesto, some 8,000 words, now known as the Geraldary Letter. It was part autobiography, part political treatise, part threat. In it, Ned railed against corruption, injustice, and police brutality. He defended his actions and demanded recognition not as a criminal, but as a man forced into rebellion. "I am a widow's son, outlawed," he wrote, "and my orders must be obeyed." The Geraldary Letter was not the work of a madman. It was the cry of a young man raised in chains, given no choice but to fight. It revealed not just his anger, but his intellect, his pride, and his sense of purpose. By now, the colony was divided. To the government, the Kelly gang were dangerous criminals. To the people of the bush, they had become something far more powerful, symbols of resistance in a land where the law too often served only the privileged. But legends cannot run forever. And in the stillness of the eucalyptus forests, the echo of their rebellion was growing louder. The government had had enough. More troopers, more spies, more force. The final confrontation was coming, and Ned Kelly knew it. He was no longer just a bushranger. He was preparing for war. By 1880, Ned Kelly had become more than a fugitive. He was a symbol of resistance, an icon forged in injustice, and the leader of a gang that had embarrassed the colonial authorities at every turn. But his vision was never just survival. It was revolution. The robberies at Euroa and Geraldary had shaken the system, but they were only the beginning. The Geraldary Letter had laid it bare. Ned Kelly wanted to expose the corruption of the police, the oppression of selectors, the hypocrisy of empire. And now he wanted to bring that message to a violent crescendo. He would stop running. He would take a stand. In the small railway town of Glenrowan, Victoria, Ned Kelly planned to launch the final act of his rebellion. It would be bold, dangerous, and, if it succeeded, historic. The plan was brutal in its ambition. The gang would sabotage the railway line and derail a train filled with police reinforcements en route from Melbourne. In the aftermath, they would strike while the police were incapacitated, capture Benalla, and declare a new order, a republic of northeastern Victoria. Whether fantasy or genuine revolutionary plan, it marked a shift from outlaw to insurgent, from fugitive to freedom fighter. In preparation, the gang began forging something extraordinary. They built suits of armor. Using plowshares, furnace iron, and scrap metal, the gang crafted 4 full sets, heavy breastplates, shoulder guards, and helmets designed to withstand bullets. Each suit weighed over 90 pounds, primitive yet effective. Bush-forged armor that transformed the Kelly gang into walking symbols of defiance. It was a statement as much as a shield. You cannot stop us. We are bulletproof. On the night of June 27, 1880, the gang rode into Glenrowan. They took over the town, holding roughly 70 hostages inside the Glenrowan Inn, operated by Ann Jones. But it wasn't cruelty. It was strategic. Ned believed that once the train derailed, the townspeople would become witnesses to history. In truth, many of the hostages later described the gang as respectful and even generous. Children were given sweets. Adults were offered food and drink. Joe Byrne played music. It was surreal, a carnival in the midst of a coup. But as the hours passed and the train failed to arrive, unease grew. And then, an unexpected act changed everything. A local school teacher, Thomas Curnow, convinced Ned to let him leave. He claimed his wife was ill. Perhaps Ned, still clinging to some idea of mercy, agreed. But Curnow did not go home. Instead, he raced to the railway tracks. As the police train approached, he lit a lantern and waved his red scarf. The signal was seen. The train screeched to a halt just before the sabotaged curve. Dozens of troopers were saved, and the element of surprise was gone. In the early hours of June 28th, police surrounded the Glenrowan Inn. Armed with rifles, they opened fire. Inside the inn, chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the walls. Children screamed. Men and women dove to the floor. Amidst the confusion, the gang donned their armor, becoming the iron ghosts they had envisioned. Gunfire rang out for hours. Joe Byrne was shot in the groin and died beside the bar. Steve Hart and Dan Kelly, trapped in a rear room, returned fire but held their position. And then, just before dawn, Ned vanished into the bush. He circled behind the police lines. Bloodied, limping, in full armor, he reappeared in the early morning mist, emerging from the trees like a myth made real. For nearly 15 minutes, he advanced alone. Bullets bounced off his chest and helmet. He fired with deadly calm, staggering forward like some ancient warrior, half man, half machine. But the armor had gaps. Bullets found his legs. Wounded and drained, Ned Kelly finally collapsed, captured, alive. Either way, the rebellion was over. Wounded, shackled, and surrounded by armed guards, Ned Kelly was taken from the smoldering wreckage of Glenrowan to Melbourne. The rebellion had failed. His friends were dead. The people who had cheered him in secret now watched in silence. He entered Melbourne jail under heavy escort. His cell was barely large enough to stretch his legs. Outside, the press painted him as both devil and folk hero. Inside, he prepared to face the full weight of the crown. In October 1880, Ned stood trial for the murder of Constable Thomas Lonigan, the first shot fired at Stringybark Creek 2 years earlier. But the trial was never truly about that one bullet. It was about the system he had defied, the police he had humiliated, and the myth he had already become. The judge was Sir Redmond Barry, a man who had long stood as a symbol of colonial justice, and the very same judge who had sentenced Ned's mother Ellen to prison. Now he would send her son to the gallows. The trial lasted barely 2 weeks. Witnesses were contradictory. The defense was rushed. The verdict, for many, felt inevitable. Guilty, sentenced to death. But even as the noose approached, the voice of the people grew louder. More than 30,000 signatures were collected to plead for mercy. Demonstrations swept through Melbourne. The young colony, still finding its identity, found itself divided. Was this justice, or was it revenge? Ned Kelly spent his final weeks writing letters, reading the Bible, and receiving visitors. He asked that his mother be allowed to see him one last time. She did. Behind the cold bars of the jail, mother and son said their final words. Then, on the morning of November 11th, 1880, under gray skies and cold stone, Ned Kelly was led to the gallows. Witnesses described him as calm, resigned. No final outburst, just a quiet breath and the words that would echo for generations. Such is life. He was 25 years old, but death did not silence Ned Kelly. It gave him permanence. He was claimed by conservatives as a nationalist, by radicals as a revolutionary, by many simply as a man who refused to be broken. And yet, beneath the mythology, there remains the undeniable truth. Ned Kelly was a killer. He robbed, he fought, and he chose violence. But he was also a product of violence, of a system that had punished his family long before he ever picked up a gun. In many ways, he became what the world told him he already was: a criminal, a threat, an outlaw. But to the poor farmers of Victoria, he was something else. A voice for the voiceless, a challenge to colonial power. A rough kind of justice born not in law, but in rage. He is part of the Australian identity, unwelcome, unresolved, unforgettable. To some, a terrorist, to others, a patriot, but to all, a story worth telling. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human, flawed, defiant, forged by struggle and fire. And because in understanding Ned Kelly, we are forced to confront the system that made him and ask whether in the century since, we have done any better.